new that we're trying. And we thought about doing it because I've been getting, and everybody who is on this call has been getting so very many questions during this time. So hopefully we would put together a good group of panelists who are going to be able to dive into, we've asked them to talk as practically as possible about the issues that each of them specialize in. So we'll be doing employment, contracts, leasing, the programs that are available to you, fundraising, crisis management, and think of this as like a rapid fire presentation. We'll send around the materials that they use on their share screen after this. You can ask questions in the chat, but I'm going to ask the questions to the panelists after they give their presentation. So if you think of something beyond what you submitted in through the Google form, feel free to use the chat. I'm going to hand this over to Amy Robinson. She's an employment attorney with Miller Nash, and we're really excited to have her. This is, I think, of all the questions I've gotten in the last 2 weeks, both on the employee side and the employer side, that takes up like a huge portion of what I'm hearing in the question. So thank you, Amy Robinson. I'm going to go on mute, and it's all yours.
Christine, did you want to say something? You want to just take it and run?
Sure. Amy, I hope it's okay. I was going to go first and then kick it off to Amy Robinson. So I hope that's okay. All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Masse. I'm an attorney at Miller Nash Graham & Dunn in Seattle. We've got offices up and down the West Coast, and I'm joined here today by my colleague, Amy Robinson. Amy's in our Vancouver, Washington office, so I thought she would be great to have today because she's very, very well versed in both Washington and Oregon. And I'm sure I'll start seeing where everybody's from here on the chat pretty soon, but I thought that would at least cover a couple jurisdictions that people would probably be calling in from. I'm going to share my screen here, hopefully, if I'm doing this right, so that you can see a PowerPoint here that we put together, and we'll make this available after the presentation. Amy Margolis, I like your dire title for what we're doing here today. And as I always feel like is my job, I'll try to end on an optimistic note as we kind of go through this. But we're going to try to give you some helpful information about the regulatory impacts that we're seeing from the COVID crisis on the cannabis industry. I'm gonna, let's see if I can advance my slides. Okay, great, here we go. I just wanted to start real quickly with a market overview. When I first wrote this, I wrote, stay-at-home orders up and down the West Coast. I could probably expand that out to a whole bunch of additional states now at this point. But in a lot of the medical states and adult use states, we're seeing stay-at-home orders. They vary a little bit from state to state. Some give a list of all of the businesses that can stay open, and cannabis is often on that. Some of them give the opposite and give a list of all of the businesses that must close, and cannabis has largely not been on that list. Up here where I am in Seattle, Washington, we largely just cribbed from California. So we have at this point, cannabis is an essential business, as is the rest of the supply chain that goes into cannabis, including kind of the immediate supply chain, which is just kind of the producers and processors up here, but also the kind of less immediate supply chain, kind of the more agricultural components that go into creating the products. So far, so good, at least for what's been essential, though there have been some jurisdictions, like the big one that's been in the press has been Massachusetts, who has closed down adult use in that state. So it's definitely a state-by-state basis, but for the most part, cannabis has been deemed essential. I think when it first got deemed essential, or at least in certain states, I think everybody felt like a big hooray, wow, it's like all this acceptance of cannabis, it's like a medicine. We're getting dumped in with pharmacies and other businesses, and I think that felt really good to people. And in large part, that was also true for rationale for why it was deemed essential. There were also some practical reasons for why it was deemed essential. I could at least speak up here in Washington. Our governor was very motivated by the fact that you know, close to $400 million worth of tax revenue is coming in per year from cannabis sales taxes. Washington State is also very sales tax driven. We don't have an income tax. And so our tax situation right now is pretty dire because nobody's spending money on anything. And so I think for our state, it was largely driven by the tax revenue. There's also been some talk that it also prevents the strengthening of the illegal market if we leave our stores open, because people are still going to use cannabis whether their stores open or not. So that was definitely another reason. I mean, I do think, though, you can see it as a demonstration that, you know, it has become more normalized, and, you know, it is more in line with other things available at a pharmacy, or the same rationale for keeping a pharmacy open. You've probably heard a lot about the different packages that have been coming out from the federal government. We're on round 3 right now. I think they're fairly disappointing for this industry. Hemp's covered, so that's good news, but a lot of the things that are available to other small businesses, which many of these cannabis businesses would have otherwise qualified, but for the cannabis component, are being excluded. So both from payroll tax credits, which Amy may talk about, and also from SBA loans, and maybe we can hear a little bit about this later. We've got someone from Wyden staff that'll be presenting, and I know there's been a real effort to try to maybe, you know, fingers crossed, get it into round 4. But anyway, that's sort of where things stand right now. And thank you to kind of headset for this data and MJ Biz, but I just wanted to put this chart in to sort of show what we're seeing kind of out in the marketplace. I think at first everyone was like, wow, it's amazing. You know, if you talk to the regulators, they were talking about how sales were up really dramatically. All anybody was doing was staying home and drinking wine and smoking weed and using toilet paper. And so, you know, we were seeing these like huge increases of sales. I think people were concerned right out of the gate that that was a bit of a hoarding mentality, and that, you know, you would see this softening. And I do think that's, at least in these 3 states that are represented on this graph, including my home state of Washington, you can see a pretty dramatic decrease. You see these big peaks when usually those coincide with some kind of announcement from a press conference from the governor, issuance of an executive order, something like that, and then they soften up after that. So anyway, I just, you know, it is great to be open, and one of the few businesses that is open, but there are also some, you know, I don't want to be all sunshine and rainbows on the industry. I did want to talk a little bit about a regulatory overview. Obviously, I can't give a 50-state survey about what we're seeing out in the market, but I did try to focus on a lot of the adult use states out here in the West, and some of the changes that we're seeing by our regulators, both state and local, as it relates to different components of the industry. So, you know, in some states, you're seeing either a easing of delivery restrictions or an encouragement. In the case of Nevada, I think delivery is the only thing that's open right now. So you are seeing some push toward delivery. I think, you know, what we're seeing up here and also in Colorado and Oregon is this curbside service idea. When our first order came out from our regulator, we had curbside service for medical card holding patients only. That was quickly changed to allow for curbside service for everyone. It's, you know, there are a lot of regulations or kind of guidelines that go around that we've been trying to help people with here on kind of SOPs on how to do it safely, both from a COVID perspective and safely from not wanting bud tenders to, you know, run across busy parking lots and things like that, and then keeping social distancing in place while bud tenders are running in and out of a store trying to make deliveries, how to do cash handling when, you know, the cash handling is happening outside of the store environment. So there's a lot of things that are going into that curbside that, but it is available for folks right now, including sort of the online ordering or phone ordering component to go with that. Another place we're seeing some changes in the regs is in possession limits. So we haven't seen that here in Washington, but at least in Oregon for medical card holders, we've seen some increases of those limits, so folks don't have to go and shop quite as frequently. I suspect we may see that in some other states as well. And then the big one that I think we've seen from pretty much every state that has allowed its cannabis businesses to stay open, which is a requirement of social distancing and potential enforcement of that. So our Liquor and Cannabis Board here in Washington is in part enforcing that, and has sort of the ability to both get people in trouble for it or also report that on. And we've got a new sort of enforcement mechanism here in Washington that includes sort of civil and potentially criminal penalties and referral out to the Attorney General's office for violations of that. And we have heard, unfortunately, of some cases of cannabis businesses sort of getting dinged for that. I think because they are one of the few businesses that are open, most of the complaints that we've heard on the social distancing side have been coming from the employees themselves, that they have been reporting out that they don't feel safe at work and that their employer is not maintaining social distancing with respect to kind of conduct in the store and conduct in the curbside delivery. The other thing we're seeing in some places is at least an appreciation for tax reduction of penalties and interest for late tax payments. So we've just had emergency rules put into place in Washington that are allowing for that. So that's kind of another piece I expect to see pop up in other jurisdictions. And then other just sort of general rules, relaxation of rules, maybe assistance from licensing departments. You know, I know Oregon has really made a pledge to try to push things through its licensing department more quickly. We're sort of seeing the opposite up here in Washington, where things are actually going more slowly because the systems that our licensing department uses are so arcane that they're not running on laptops for employees that are working from home. So we've actually had a slowdown in processing speed. So things like that too that I think we'll be seeing on kind of the regulatory front. I also want to talk about contracting overview. I've got a few things in here. I think my overall advice would be communication is key. Whichever side of the contract you're on, whether you're the one paying the money or you're the one receiving, you know, the service or the product, staying in communication is really, really important. So a couple of things that are sort of the buzzwords that we're hearing now, obviously on the contracting side, is force majeure, which this would be a pandemic, right? This would be, you know, kind of natural disasters, labor strikes, things like that typically fall into this kind of clause, and folks are trying to add pandemic into that. And what that means is there may be relief under the contract from certain terms or payment terms or the contract altogether if one of those things happens. So there's a lot of conversation around whether a pandemic is a force majeure event. That's sort of a, I mean, that's, in my mind, that's kind of a last ditch effort. That's not where we start. We just start with communication to the vendor about whether you're going to be late with a payment or whether you're going to be late with a delivery if you're on the other side, before we start jumping into these, you know, kind of contractual breach ideas. But still, they're just worth maybe a brief discussion. Also, impracticability, impossibility, frustration of purpose. These are other ways that, you know, people can kind of get out of contracts if they need to. But again, those are all sort of last ditch type things. Leases is a big one because obviously with revenues down, it's a lot harder to pay the rent. Oregon has really been out front on this. They've got a moratorium right now on commercial evictions. Now, just to be clear, this doesn't mean you don't have to pay your rent. Rent is not kind of abated indefinitely or forgiven. Rent is just deferred. So in fact, it's not even really deferring your rent. It's basically just saying that they can't kick you out for 90 days if you didn't pay your rent. So this is a great sort of provision if you're a tenant, that you can stay, but do keep in mind that 90 days will end. And so working closely with your landlord to try and figure out a payment plan and committing that payment plan to writing would be a great idea. Financing, I'll just touch on this briefly because I know not everyone is fortunate enough to have financing in this industry. But again, just kind of common practice, do stay in touch with your financiers, whether those are private individuals or whether you're maybe a ancillary business that's fortunate enough to have a line of credit or small business loan. Staying in touch with your banker is really, really critical if you're gonna, miss any payments, if you need forbearance, if you're not meeting your covenants, things like that. The banks are and lenders are in a tough position too. They don't really want to call you into default because they want you to make good on your on the debt. And so working with them to kind of come to some sort of payment term could be advantageous. Also on here, insurance. This is a big buzzy one right now, which is this concept of business interruption insurance. A lot of policies don't cover coronavirus or a pandemic as a business interruption. So we saw after the SARS crisis several years ago, a lot of the terms of these policies changed because at that time people were making claims for business interruption because of SARS. So now you see some exceptions in some of these policies for something like the coronavirus, but there's no harm in submitting a claim. So, and in many cases that is a necessary prerequisite to doing anything else from there. And so, we have been encouraging people to really take a look at their policy, talk to their broker and consider a claim for submitting a claim for a business interruption. On the lasting effects side, whether any of these regulatory changes will stick, I think remain to be seen. I do think there may be some, it'll depend too, whether the businesses are actually enjoying doing this and that it's working and that the SOPs are working and that they're making money doing it, whether they continue to push for this kind of curbside pickup and delivery. Same with possession and sales limits. I think what people are hoping is that if the regulators realize the world hasn't come to an end and every single person that buys cannabis is not out there reselling it on the street as a, kind of contributing to an illegal market type position, that maybe they will relax some of those limits. I think that remains to be seen. Another thing we're seeing is just maybe a re-examination of some of these regulations and whether they actually tie to some sort of strong policy. Up here in Washington, largely our regulations were drafted in 2013. That's eons ago by cannabis standards. And so it's at least giving us a bit of a re-examination of whether the regulations that we have in place are actually achieving the goals that they were set out to achieve. So I'm hoping that maybe we'll see some relaxation on those up here. Also, we've heard it from OLCC, not yet on the Washington side, but at least in Oregon, that they've really been upgrading a lot of their systems, remote work, response times, things like that, which hopefully will have a lasting effect to kind of keep businesses moving more smoothly. And also just what we'd like to see too, or what I'm hoping we see, is a little bit of a relaxation of some of the really kind of onerous vetting around financing, at least up here in Washington. Putting an investment into one of these cannabis businesses frequently takes longer than 90 days. I know for many of you, if you didn't get an influx of cash in 90 days, it would be too late. And so we're hoping that some of this sort of helps the regulators start to appreciate that business is fluid and that regular type business loans aren't available to cannabis businesses. And so it really is important that when they do identify somebody who is willing to put an influx of money into their business, that needs to be moved more quickly, or else, businesses miss payroll or can't, pay a vendor or can't get a delivery. You know, as I've been calling into a whole bunch of these myself, and as I've talked, you know, listened to some of the more national ones, here's my kind of silver lining, optimistic, maybe something good will come from this. Don't forget that when this is over, we're going to need some serious economic stimulation, right? We have this problem. All these businesses are closed. Nobody is spending any money. You know, the market's in the tank. Everybody's stock prices are depressed. People are losing their jobs. And so, you know, phase 4 or 5 or 6 or whatever it is that the federal government and the state governments put out is going to be focused on how to stimulate the economy moving forward. Cannabis can help be that, right? There's still room in the cannabis market. It's a new industry. There's, you know, still a lot of room for growth. In a lot of these communities, the cannabis industry is providing a whole bunch of jobs and a whole bunch of tax revenue to local and state jurisdictions. And so I think what some folks are hoping is that maybe coming out of this, there is an appreciation for that and a, you know, understanding that maybe cannabis, not that it's going to be the solution to the economic crisis moving forward, but that it can be, the industry can be a strong player in helping kind of kickstart the economy moving forward once we're not talking about being shut down for COVID, but how to kind of make up for all that lost time. So I want to save most of my time for Amy because Amy is going to get a million questions about labor and employment. I did want to put this up on the screen. We are keeping cannabis related materials up on our website, all COVID-19 cannabis related. It's all sorted by topic. So if, you know, if there are things that you want more information on, I obviously couldn't talk about every reg in every jurisdiction today, but we've got links up on our website. So please come visit us there. Thanks.
So thank you. That was excellent. Does anybody have any, you can use the Q&A feature on this, or you can use the chat feature. Does anybody have any questions that they want to ask Chris? And then I just want to add a couple things that came across my mind while Chris was talking. The first is the tenant issues and the idea, at least for those of you in Oregon, about the commercial evictions. And I just want to be clear because I feel like the kind of media that's out there, Chris is exactly right, but I want to say it out loud because I needed somebody to say it out loud to me, is that just because they can't evict you doesn't mean they can't default you. And it doesn't mean they can't sue you, and it doesn't mean that they cannot come after you. So even though they can't kick you out, they can take all of the action that's available to them under your lease. So I think it's something to consider as you're deciding what to do. I'm sure we all got, who have leases, something that says, you know, hey, if you're either we're not doing anything for you, or we'll talk to you about deferment, or send us what your situation is. But just keep in mind that even though they can't kick you out, doesn't mean that they can't come after you. And I wanted to add for the Oregon, you know, we don't have so many people who are sick here, but I have had a situation, not currently I have a situation where there's an issue around a power of attorney where somebody is not well and they cannot handle the business. And I will let you know that the Oregon Regulatory Authority has not decided how to handle what happens to people's licenses when they get sick. So I would urge you, if you're a licensee and somebody is sick who's an applicant, or maybe the sole applicant is sick, at least here in Oregon, that you reach out. You're welcome to reach out to us. You can reach out to Miller Nash. You can reach out to your own lawyers, like to reach out so you don't trigger an unintended consequence, because we're in conversations with them, and that's been something that has been sort of challenging. And then I know Ree is going to talk about the SBA loan, but if he doesn't, somebody like ping me on that chat thing and remind me that I have something to say about it. And then I see that somebody has asked, I have a hemp business and the SBA morality lending restrictions prohibit me from applying to any of these financial programs. Any idea how to approach the issue? All the SBA programs require that any probation be dispositioned in at least 6 months from application. I think let's save that. I'm going to save that question. Let's talk to Ree about that question, unless Chris, you want to answer that.
No, that's great. I would say do ask Ree. And then also I did know, you know, for those of you, I know you get a million different like mailing lists every day, but I did notice that the MJ Biz was doing one on hemp and the SBA program next week. So that might be worth folks' time too if they have specific questions for the SBA program as it relates to hemp.
So let's put, we'll put this pin in this and I'll save it and we'll ask Ree when he gets back on. Okay, let me make sure. Amy Robinson. Oh, wait, I have somebody else here. I was ready to launch my business online and through retail chains. Now, do we need to hold back buying inventory and a launch date? When would you suggest to start a new business for hemp products? Let's save that for Emily Paxhia, because I think she's going to talk about fundraising and kind of business planning. So Denise, let's save that for Emily. I'll keep track of all of these.
Great.
Okay, thanks, Chris. That was excellent. Now, I pre-introduced Amy Robinson, so take it away.
Great. Thanks so much. Okay, first let me get this screen share going. I think I've done it. Here we go. Okay, so I'll tell you, I'm going to probably cover a lot in a very short amount of time, so I'll try to not go too quickly. However, I will say, I thought I'd start out with some basics. What we're finding is a lot of folks didn't necessarily know employment rules terribly deeply before now, and then we sort of upset the apple cart. There have been a lot of changes. There have been whole new areas of law that have developed just in the last couple of weeks. So what I thought I'd do is kind of march through this with some basics around, let's see, let me get my thing working here. This is the fun of it. So let's start with kind of what assumptions are still true, and then we can get into what has changed. So first and foremost, 3-4 weeks ago when this was emerging in the Northwest, at least, it was, what is my responsibility to employees? As employees started reporting, they were nervous about things. They were hearing about these, the virus. So number one, and this is not something that a lot of workplaces frankly think about from day to day, but where this comes up is from the Occupational Safety and Health Act, the federal act, and each state typically has its own equivalent. I know we do in Oregon and Washington where I practice. And that requires that employers make sure that they provide a safe and healthy workplace. And that first bullet point really covers about as detailed as this gets in this particular area, which is avoiding known hazards. The good news here is that obviously is something that is hard to assess right now as we learn more about how the virus spreads, as there's more information locally around where things are happening. But OSHA early on published a guidance. I'm going to hold it up here because I'm a bit of a nerd about this stuff. OSHA published guidance on preparing workplaces for COVID. For those of you who may have been dealing with this stuff, researching resources, that is a publication that started out being useful. It still is very useful. They have updated that guidance. But that's where they're talking about, if you're, again, going back to what kind of Chris was talking about, you are either in sort of full all-out operations, or you've at least streamlined to what's minimally necessary if you're not an essential business, to just kind of make sure, do a health check on it, or deal with payroll or work from home. So this is assuming that there's an operation at some that is active. You want to make sure that you're taking appropriate steps to prevent known hazards. So that's where the social distancing comes in. Of course, that's a requirement now for states that have issued orders related to that, but also that resource that I was just holding up, it's called the Guidance on Preparing Workplaces for COVID-19. It talks a lot about steps you can take when you're in operation, alternatives to not being in operation when you maybe have folks who are concerned about their well-being. What more could you be doing? That's a great resource for that. It talks about things like engineering controls in addition to, social distancing is one, increased hygiene techniques, increasing air filter capacity and updating that, given that some of the things are airborne. This OSHA works though in tandem with the CDC that also has guidance around that. So where are we from a best practice, from a simple safety standpoint today? There are some obvious kind of 1, 2, 3s there. Number one, make sure your folks know not to come to work sick. Your obligation at this point, there are posters out there, virtually every occupational health agency has them, talking about making sure folks know, number one, don't come to work sick. Number two, know the symptoms, particularly of this disease, which are fever, elevated temperature of 100.4 or more, dry cough, and shortness of breath. So to know what to do if one of your employees has those symptoms, make sure it's clear to them that A, they shouldn't come to work. If they are at work, what is the protocol? Protocol right now is you make sure that there's a safe space, you separate from the rest of folks, and you maybe, depending on the circumstance, if they're really experiencing serious symptoms, you may need to reach out to, obviously, paramedics. If it's, gosh, I'm not sure what's going on, you may want to remove them, get them to a safe place to either go home. Right now, the guidance available based on potential symptoms is you want to send those folks home, make sure they've got access to their healthcare provider, they know to do that. Typically, they won't know right then, but you'll want to keep in touch and have them respond once they know a little more. There's not always the ability to get into a healthcare provider. So right now that's been a moving target. But if they are able to, most employers are recommending if there's been either an employee reporting contact with somebody who's been exposed or potential symptoms, it ranges from 7 to 14 days. You want them out of the workplace depending on the circumstance. So there are going to be steps to make sure, and then you'll deal with do you need to tell anyone else based on potential exposure? One of the considerations in mind there early on, we were getting a lot of questions about, gosh, somebody lives with somebody who may be tested positive. Don't I need to send an email to everybody on my team? And the answer is you may need to communicate contact with somebody where it may involve potential exposure, but you only need to do that to the extent necessary, and you have to balance that with responsibilities for privacy around the employee themselves. That's medical information. There are laws that kick in that say you shouldn't be announcing the person's name in particular. What you'll want to do is, and I typically recommend you talk with folks and say, gosh, we're gonna need to talk with, who have you been near, get an understanding from where the contact within the workplace has been, and then you may need to reverse engineer some communications with the folks where there's been prolonged contact. And then typically, even if it seems obvious, you don't reveal their name without their consent, and they of course can withhold that. Those steps are some that are in the CDC and OSHA guidance to walk through. The other thing that I think is helpful, given the sense of, frankly, panic going on, rightly in some contexts, and sometimes it's an overreaction, there is some good information in that CDC resource about what actual risk factors are. I have a lot of HR folks and hands-on business owners who are keeping that resource handy to talk about that. Actually, unless you're truly having some serious, prolonged, close contact with somebody who's been positive, the chances of actually contracting the virus are quite small. That is simply a practical tip to help folks know there's no cause to panic, but here's some steps we can take. So that's the current state of the world on kind of what's safe operations right now in the COVID world. We talked about the shelter in place, stay home orders. If again, in our area, you're either in essential operations or you're not, in which case you usually have the ability to do limited operations to keep business open. One of the questions we've gotten a lot in the last couple of weeks is, don't we need a letter to give folks so they're driving to and from work? And the answer is you do not. There's no requirement to have that. You certainly can do that as a courtesy if it's helpful to keep your teams kind of feeling confident about it. Although, as Chris mentioned, there is also enforcement on this, on the increase. And I was just hearing this morning in a different session I was in about some fraudulent inspections going on in this regard. So if you have somebody who comes in and says you're not allowed to operate, be aware you may want to reach out because they likely are not, there could be the possibility that they're not legitimate. I'm sorry to hear that that's going on for folks. So, but where this is really coming up a lot right now is when if you're in a functional capacity right now, you're able to operate either, and you have employees, when are they entitled to time away, either because they're sick or for these other reasons. And again, given that the world has shifted, some of this may be obvious, but there's also a lot of things that were used to be obvious that have changed. So I want to just really quickly kind of walk through when, because I see a lot of missteps here, when an employee wants to be away from work or not report in, when are they entitled to do so, and when may they have pay obligations that kick in. So the first source for that, and I'm going to get at the new leaves in a minute, are state paid sick leaves. So in Washington and Oregon, for example, employers have an obligation to provide a certain amount of paid sick leave. In many contexts, those will be triggered. I'll give you an example. In both Oregon and Washington have developed really good, practical, and I'm happy to share these resources if anybody needs them. They're also on our website. Resources around what is the particular circumstance that the person needs to be out, what is the scope of, what is the reason, and is it triggering sick leave or something else? For example, if the worker themselves are ill or fear they're ill, they're probably entitled to sick leave under the state laws, at least that I deal with. Likewise, they may need time away to care for a family member. Be careful, family member can be very, very loosely defined. For example, the person may tell you, well, it's my aunt. Okay, that may not come within your typical definition of family member. However, under a couple of these statutes, family member includes a person who's in loco parentis to the person. So you find out that aunt raised them. That may trigger that protection. So right now, I'll tell you as a practical matter, where there's a potential for paid sick leave to be triggered, I think the safer course is to provide it and not get into debates about that. But on the other hand, if the person is just simply concerned about the state of the world and they're not able to report to work, that's not quite so clear. There may be an entitlement to it, and I'll jump ahead here. If the person, for example, may suffer from another underlying condition that causes them to be particularly vulnerable, that may also include mental health considerations that can factor in here. They may be entitled to that time away, not necessarily paid unless the paid sick leave is still available, but there are also disabilities laws that could kick in and entitle them to be away without suffering negative consequences. In Washington, we also have the paid family and medical leave that just kicked in and may provide time off if they hit the serious health condition definition. So it has to be serious. But those are some of the things we're wrestling with there. The other one is, and I haven't seen this a lot, but there was a lot of concern early on around military service leave. Remember, most employers are subject to USERRA, which provides protected time off for folks for military service, and that may include things like responding to the National Guard, and I know there's some call-ups going on, so be aware about that. Where I'm hoping to spend most of our time, I thought I'd get at some of those basics, is with these new emergency paid leaves, and I'm just going to get some mixed answers out front. For those of you who aren't aware, this applies to all U.S. employers with less than 500 employees. Lots of questions around, is that a typo? No, it isn't a typo. I won't talk about the background of it. It's just under 500 for that one. And what it will require is employers to provide two types of paid benefits. These are out of employers' pockets, subject to, and here's where the bad news comes in, tax credits for the cost of those benefits. Unfortunately, the information we're told from our tax folks is that those tax credits, given cannabis operations with very few exceptions, are not going to be available to most of you, which is unfortunate. However, that does not relieve the obligation to provide these leaves, at least that we've found yet. And again, we could get more guidance, but based on what we know today, and I've started almost saying that to the hour, given how fast it's changing. But as of right now, what we know is this should apply to you if you have less than 500 employees. That headcount is based on what you have at the time of the request. So there's not a strict date to it. It's not today. It's not a week from now. It's when you get the leave request, you look for that. So employers that fluctuate will want to be aware of that. It went into effect yet Wednesday, April 1. I'm losing track of days. And it will sunset at the end of the year. And there are two types. I'll get more into them in a minute. But the first is emergency paid sick leave. And the second is Emergency Family and Medical Leave Act. So if I fall into my terminology, it's EPSL is the paid sick bucket, EFMLA is the other bucket. I'm going to help us work through this with a little chart here. So and the poster has it. Does it have it? Oh no, it's right. EFMLA, I'm going to reverse this. Paid sick leave is full-time employees. It's up to 80 hours. So if you have folks who are full-time or who are salaried, it's an 80-hour bucket. If you have part-time employees, it's the equivalent of a 2-week balance that you would load in at the time if they needed 2 weeks. You would assess that based on their regular schedule, or you would do, if it fluctuates, whether they're full or part-time and you're not sure what the regular schedule is because it's not that reliable, the rules say from the date of the leave request, you look back 6 months and then you make an average determination. You also would pay that at the regular rate or minimum wage, whichever is greater, obviously. That amount of leave is paid at, for the reasons I'll get into in a minute. The first category, which is a personal, which I'm calling personal sick leave, is 100% of their base pay, capped though at $511 a day. For the other, it's a 2/3 portion. The other bucket is this emergency FMLA, and that is for employers who are less than 50. They're not typically covered by the FMLA, but in this case, the choice was made that everybody with 499 or less employees will be counted for this. So this is new for folks who have less than 50, but it still applies to them, which is up to 12 weeks of protected absences, and a portion of that is paid. The first 10 days, so the first 2 weeks is unpaid. I think the assumption is that the emergency paid sick leave will be used by most folks for that. And then the rest is paid at that 2/3 regular rate with a cap of $200 a day. So let me get into and it's not in the sheet. Let me get into the reasons for that, which is probably the most important thing. The reasons for that, and I'm gonna refer to them by number because the Department of Labor, and this alert on the poster, if you haven't seen it, also on our website, but DOL poster just came out, refers to 6 leaves, and I think it's important for helping folks continue to understand it. First kind of leave for emergency paid sick leave is an employee's can't work because of a quarantine or isolation order from a government authority. The second, and I'll come back to that one. The second one is quarantine or isolation order from a healthcare professional. The third one, and these line up with the 1, 2, 3s on our sheet here, are for the employees experiencing symptoms and awaiting a diagnosis. So those are the first 3 reasons that trigger that full pay with the increased $511 cap on it. The next 3 are reason number 4, caring for an individual who is either been quarantined or subject to an isolation order from a government official or a public healthcare provider. Number 5 is the big one because it merges both of those EFMLA and EPSL, is for if the employee cannot work or telework because their child is home as a result of the closure of their school, daycare, or place of care that they regularly go that they were paying for. So those are the reasons that would trigger most of those reasons, 1 through 4, and and 6 I forgot because it's a sort of a generic other category that says or other similar circumstances defined by Human Health and Services. And that seems to be a big source of questioning. And the answer that I have so far is, I think it's just a catch-all bucket. I think it's one of those where while they were doing this law, they were worried maybe something else would come along that was something other than COVID. And so they wanted to be able to get at that if there was a determination made that they needed it. So for most of those, we're just dealing with the 80 hours bucket. For that reason number 5, we're dealing with these 2 in tandem. Let me answer a couple of details around how those are working in specific based on the rules that came out this week. First, I think I mentioned this, head count you deal with at the day of the request. You are able for those purposes to count everybody, it's by body, it's not by FTE, and you get to count everybody, even those who you may, if you have anybody through a temp service or a day laborer or those kinds of things, the only folks you can't count are truly independent contractors. The other thing is, there is, and I think this will apply to you potentially, small business exemption for employers under 50. There was lots of questions about how that exception was going to work. What we know right now is it appears like it's going to be a self-certification process. I'm a little, I think there's some open questions about kind of how that's really going to shake out, especially for your industry in particular, because most of that is going to be enforced through the IRS filings. And so we'll kind of see how this all shakes out. But the way they've proposed it is employers would make a determination that by an officer has to make a determination that one of three things is true. One of which is, we can't afford it as a business. It will truly, providing these leaves will put us out of business. That is one that seems to be something that can be a determination that can be made on an ongoing basis. The other two are more at the time of the leave specific, which is this individual or group of individuals who have now requested leave are ones that have such a unique skill set or expertise or responsibility, we cannot continue to operate without them. So sort of a functional exception. And the third one is, if that person or group of folks was out, we wouldn't have the ability to cover things in a way that would keep us minimally operative. Those are subtle differences between those last two, but that's how the small business exception will work. There is a 4-year document retention requirement with all of the compliance here. So as folks are requesting leave, as you're evaluating whether it applies, and as you're making any determinations in hopes of the small business exemption, you will want to make sure that you're documenting those things and retaining them in a safe place for that 4-year period. One other thing I should mention, because I think this is really happening more than it did in other contexts, much of what we're able to do and what we can really require right now, it's very difficult to require things like medical certification. So that is not part of this act. There is the ability to get some information to verify the legitimacy of the need, but there's a lot of trust happening right now. So for example, you can ask the employee for the name of their provider, and you can ask them, if we get into that reason number 5, you can ask for, tell me the names of your, the names of your children and why you're not able to telework, what's the period of time. But it's very difficult to get those certifications right now. So as a practical matter, it's frankly just not happening. The other thing that we were a bit surprised by was that that first category on the screen there, the emergency FMLA, is going to be able to be used intermittently, meaning not the first bucket, but when we're dealing with somebody who maybe is teleworking while their kids are home from school, if they want to work rather than take a full, whatever the block of time they need is, they could, rather than take the full day, they could work part day, and you could pay them for part day, and then they can use EFMLA for the other. But that will be at employers' options, not as an entitlement that they have. So there's a little flexibility on that. I had one other, the other one that applies is, that was a surprise on Wednesday, was this also will allow, if you are already FMLA covered and you have a policy that says things like, if you're on FMLA, you have to use available vacation while you're out. As you know, usually FMLA is unpaid except unless you offer paid leave. In this case, you're going to be able to do that with this EFMLA as long as it's not during that same period that EPSL is. So a few additional surprises there. The biggest question I get, and I meant to mention it right at the top, is, okay, if this went into effect on 4/1, and an employee, we have employees asking us right now, and this is happening all over the place, gosh, I think I am nervous about coming in. I don't have a health condition per se, but isn't in Washington, for example, Governor Inslee's order, isn't that enough to qualify as a quarantine or isolation order under that reason number 1 that I was mentioning in the beginning? And the answer from the DOL right now, and I know there is some controversy around it from what I've heard already, is no. That doesn't close the business. It's not individualized enough, essentially, to trigger that paid leave component. So two things. One, general orders with a few exceptions that won't count unless it's individualized. So here's an example of individualized that I can conceive of. If, for example, there's an outbreak at a location that they know there may be, and public health comes in and says, we know it was here, we need to close everything and deep clean for the next 3 days, and you've got to get everybody out of here. That's going to be different, okay? It also, the guidance was clear for us, thankfully, that where somebody maybe was already out because they were ill, or they've been quarantined because they were exposed and are waiting a test that they either can or can't get at this point. Anything that started before the effective date, which was Wednesday, doesn't count. It would need to be a new need for leave that occurs after 4/1 and before the end of the year. Okay, I've probably almost used up, if not already used up, a lot of my time. There's lots to say about this stuff, but I want to talk about the practical kind of where are we at if we either aren't able to operate or we can't, our business is suffering because just because the market is what the market is. Here's a few kind of brass tacks for you. Number one, I want to be really thoughtful about a couple of things. Wage and hour stuff. There are no hardship exceptions to paying wages that are earned. That's the big one. So there are no exceptions for private industry that would allow any employee to work off the clock or do volunteering. So if somebody says, I know you can't pay me right now, but I really believe in what we're doing and I'm part of this and I wanna help out, you absolutely are obligated to pay. Please don't allow volunteer work at this time, although that's wonderful quality and there may be nice ways to incentivize them other way. The other one is make sure you do have the ability to adjust pay rates. Just make sure, obviously, that you do it prospectively. So you want to, my typical guidance is make sure you do it. Don't do it today and think you're going to go back in time. Make sure you're doing it at a clear break in the pay period, ideally, so that is something going forward. The other options that we're seeing folks kind of weighing around is things like staggering shifts. So reducing, that's both a strategy for cost controls, but also one of the practical tips you'll see from the OSHA guidance around how to minimize exposure. Rather than have everybody work that same window, maybe you change your hours up a little bit and you have smaller staff at different times. Schedule reductions is the other one. And I'm going to spend the last bit of my time talking about layoffs and furlough, or temporary layoffs, or what I call furloughs or standbys, and actual layoffs. Couple of different concepts here that folks are wrestling with. The first, that temporary layoff and furlough means we think we're sort of pushing pause on the business or on the employment relationship. We're not ending it yet. We are hoping to resume. We're hoping to have you back. And I'll talk in a minute about what that is. Layoffs, terminations are a permanent thing. So the first one is a temporary thing, and the second one is potentially a permanent thing. And there are strategies, but also special considerations to both. So I did a little bit, because this question unfortunately started coming up more and more in the last couple of weeks. What protections, or what's the upside, or what do I need to keep in mind as the differences I'm weighing whether this is long-term, besides just maybe I need more time and I don't know yet, okay? Health insurance benefits for employers who really want to be able to keep folks on while they figure out what's next. You can, when you're in standby or furlough, as long as there's not a separation of employment. Once somebody terminates, typically you actually can't. And here's I want you to be careful, because there's, in your health insurance plans, people sort of, when I was in HR before I became a lawyer, so this is about 25 years ago, we used to keep people on and just kind of let them stay on health insurance. And that is a thing of the past. Now insurers have become much more savvy. They're very careful about what eligibility requirements somebody must meet to be able to get the benefits of the health insurance. And that can be triggered whether there's an end of employment or not. So you'll want to check that to make sure if you're evaluating a temporary stoppage, standby, you want to make sure what is the window of time that somebody can be not in full-time status, because most of those eligibility requirements are tied to minimum number of hours per week. Sometimes that's in the context of a leave. In this case, it would be in the context of a stand down. Often that's as much as 3 months. Sometimes that's as little as a couple of weeks. So that you want to consult that policy, because what you don't want to do is not realize they've lost eligibility, and then they're uninsured in a way that creates issues. So that's a little practical suggestion. Unemployment insurance. This has been a moving target, both Oregon and Washington, and I think most states right now have, or at least are in the middle of contemplating, largely as a result of the CARES Act that just passed last Friday, changes to their unemployment insurance programs. Washington, frankly, was ahead of the game from my practicing on both sides of the river here. I will say they were ahead of this and had already waived things like the waiting period. They already extended the amount of time that an employee can be in what's called standby status, which is this furlough, and get unemployment. So you get unemployment in a furlough, but the unemployment rules will decide how long you can be in standby status, which then relaxes the requirement that you would otherwise have to be seeking employment. So in a standby furlough status, the employee can still get unemployment and they don't have to affirm that they're out there looking for work, which is nice for the business who intends to return them. Washington changed the rules from 4 weeks, which is what it was pre-COVID, to now 12 weeks. Oregon, I understand, is in the process of making that change. Again, with CARES, it increased funding here, that will add $600 per week to the maximum on top of what the employee would already be getting if they qualify for unemployment. And by the way, that we understand that applies to anybody on unemployment, not just COVID-related reasons, and extends the potential period of coverage from 26 weeks, at least in Oregon, Washington, I believe California, to 39. So it increases at 13 weeks. Obviously, unemployment also available in a layoff situation. They've lost their job long-term. Lastly, some things to think about: final paycheck rules. Again, there are very strict protections around paychecks for folks. This is not a place to get creative. Let me just say it that way. When you're in a furlough situation, you're not thinking that you're paying them a final paycheck because you're hoping to have them back. That may be true, but you want to be careful in your local jurisdiction because state laws will govern when somebody may have triggered final paycheck rules anyway. For example, in Oregon, if your furlough is expected to last more than 35 days, you may have triggered final payroll, which means you have to make sure you've tendered that paycheck by the next business day after the furlough has begun. And if you have any commitments to pay out things like sick pay or PTO or vacation, again, those are voluntary, but if you've committed to it in a policy, it's a wage claim, so you better get it paid. My colleague in California pointed out to me that in California, that window is as small as 2 weeks. So while when we're looking at the unemployment laws, yes, we can use the furlough, you want to make sure these other laws come into play too that you want to make sure you've followed. Again, I've included some links there for how it works in Oregon and Washington. Washington is much easier that way, and they just pay at the next regular payroll date, whereas Oregon has strict timeframes based on when they are. So those are that's a lot to kind of consolidate into a short period of time. Hopefully that's helpful to you. We've got probably more resources than you ever want, but if you have trouble sleeping, you can look at them on our website.
Thank you. So if anybody has a question right now, I have one question that's already come in. You should send it in. And then I also wanted to say that if we open this up so people could submit questions ahead of time, but if you have general questions that you want answered, I have 1,000 million questions that I want answered right now. Like, when will this end? But I think, like, if you have general questions, we'll take a few minutes in between probably Emily and Ree, or between Ree and Ryan, to like go through it and answer as many of those questions as we can to be helpful. So, I mean, I have lots of questions about like whether or not, you know, how you can apply for unemployment if you're self-employed. You need to have paid payroll taxes. Like questions like that are good questions to ask now while we have so many resources on the video. So if you have random questions or things that come through your mind, or by the time we get through Emily and Ree, we haven't answered what you're here for, you should start sending those in through the Q&A, and we'll do our best to answer those. And so the one question we do have for this is paid leave on top of existing PTO that might have already been taken?
Yes.
Okay, that's a great succinct answer.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I get some sort of award for that. A lawyer answered one word, right? Yes, this is all brand new leaves that need to go on top of whatever you were doing, with the exception of that surprise that I mentioned for eFMLA, where you may be able to require them to use it simultaneously. They really don't interact, other than this is just a whole, what I call a new bucket that just gets added. Another practical tip I will give you is, I had a couple of folks calling me in the last couple of days saying, so do we need to go into payroll and basically put a whole new 80 hours in their current paid sick leave bucket? And the answer that I gave them that I'm suggesting is, please don't do that, because these are very different buckets. If you're working with a payroll company, most of them are setting up these separate codes to track this. But as I mentioned, it may or may not be 80 hours. So my suggestion is to make sure you're doing it right, and you're doing it with the current guidance, given how much things are changing. If you get a request, do the work to do that then, and then at that time you would load in the relevant bucket, or you would apply it manually at the time that you were processing payroll, so that they're getting A, the right amount, and B, I should mention, rate of pay also includes things like non-discretionary bonuses. When you're looking at what the right rate of pay is, you got to consider overtime in that 6-month look back period. So you may want to be careful about doing that determination based on the guidance at the time of the leave request, because I'd love to think we know everything right now and it's all locked in, but I think that's naive.
So I actually have a couple questions for you myself that I think are helpful. And just short and concise as possible, because I know I'm cutting into somebody else's time. Am I liable? I mean, I'm a lawyer, but I'm asking you this question because I think people want to know. Like, am I liable if somebody gets sick while they're at work with me? So I'm a dispensary. Maybe we didn't take all the precautions. Maybe with plastic shield up. Maybe we didn't. Maybe we didn't just do curbside, maybe we didn't provide masks soon enough. Am I liable? And I know I don't know that you're an employment litigator, but so you can tell me that I should give my best answer. But like, you know, should dispensaries be thinking about their liabilities and continuing operations, and also the way that they're running those operations?
First, easy answer is yes, they should be thinking about this, and yes, there's a potential for liability. Normally, if you have an injury in the workplace, you're triggering workers' comp. In this case, we've got an issue where it's very hard, unless the person is a healthcare provider in an emergency room treating COVID, it's very hard right now. And you'll see resources, for example, if you're in Oregon, SAFE has some resources on this front that says there are going to be proof issues here, but as a general matter, we don't think that most of these things, it's going to be just practically difficult to prove that the source of the exposure was the workplace, as opposed to out in the general, out in society. So that's a blessing and a curse, because obviously if workers' comp rejects it, then they don't have coverage, which means folks are going to be looking for every way they can argue that the business was negligent in not protecting them, if that's where they think they can prove it, or if it's worth rolling the dice. So that is the reason to take these precautions very seriously. And I do think, there's a practical reason I referenced that dorky OSHA manual, because I think that's actually going to be a really important source of defense if somebody says you didn't do enough. Gosh, why didn't I think you're going to be answering questions in a deposition around, you know, did you explore changing your filters? You know, what were you doing, if they can get that far? But yeah, I think you theoretically absolutely should expect some scrutiny around, did you do enough? And of course there's insurance as well that may cover, but a lot of those have exclusions for these kinds of issues. So there may be, you know, your employment practices might offer insurance if your workers' comp doesn't. But
Heidi asked, is there a resource for what documentation will be required from the IRS to get the tax credit for the FFCRA leave?
yes, that was just updated 2 days ago. The IRS has its own, has both the forms you need to submit and guidance around what that documentation looks like. It's also linked through the DOL question site, although the way they updated the website actually makes it a little bit harder to find. So I would probably look on the IRS page, and we have links on our site, but they're there. So if that can be helpful, or feel free to reach out to me and I'll send them.
Okay, that's great. And I see other questions up here. I think those will either be answered by other folks, or I'll answer them if nobody else does. Amy, that was excellent. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome. Take care.
Thank you. All right.
Oh, sorry. Got to turn off my screen.
I did an unfortunate screen share the other day. So next up is Emily Paxhia. For most of you, Emily doesn't need any introduction. She is one of the partners at Wyden, and they help fund people in the cannabis industry. Emily's been around forever. She is a frequent participant in the initiative programming. And I asked Emily to talk because I mean, everyone should be doing crisis planning right now. I mean, every single one of us should be doing it, from the lawyers all the way down. Everyone is thinking about it. So I'm hopeful that that this will be helpful, and that she's also going to talk about fundraising, because many of you are in the middle of your fundraise. Many of you are going to need to fundraise, and I think all of us are wondering what's going to happen next. So thanks, Emily.
Thank you, Amy, and hello, everybody. I hope you're well and safe wherever you are. It's certainly an interesting time. So I'm going to endeavor to share my screen and just share that. Okay. Okay. Is this working? I'm one of those nightmare people right now who's doing the Zoom thing. Why isn't this? There we go. Why? Amy, I might need you to share can you share that PowerPoint that
Yeah, Angela will need to send it to me. Are you hitting the share screen button on your bottom of your thing?
Yeah, and it's saying I need to restart Zoom. I'm one of those.
Don't do that.
No. Here, wait, let me send you, I'm going to send you really quickly my most recent PowerPoint.
Okay.
And I'll
my email or my text?
By email.
Okay. I'll open it as soon as I get it. Share my screen.
While we're doing this, I just wanted to start off by telling everybody that I want you to keep faith right now, because it is a really interesting time, but I do think that there's a lot to be done during a time of crisis and during a downturn. I always say that, what's it called? You know, a bull market, which means everything's going up and to the right. I always say it obscures a multitude of sins, but it's if you can survive the bear, it's when you know you have a real business. And I think that we're going to learn a lot about ourselves and about our industry and about our businesses during that time. Just a little bit about myself. I'm a co-founder and managing partner of Wyden. We've been investing in cannabis entirely since January 2014. We have 2 funds in the space, and we've invested everything from pre-concept or like early concept pre-seed stage companies all the way through to doing lending with companies that have been running for 10 plus years who are in scaling mode. Amy, did you get that yet?
No, will you text it to me? Can you attach it to it's not coming through my
email. Shoot. Okay. Bear with me, everyone. Amy, do you want to ask other employment questions while I do this?
Well, maybe I'll answer a couple of these questions that are in.
Okay. Why don't we do that?
Meryl, I saw that you asked that it looks like SBA loans under 10,000, which go towards utility and payrolls, are automatically forgiven. Is this true? That simple? What else do we need to know? Also, if we apply for the Prosper Portland grant, does that count as part of the SBA forgiven loans if we get the grant? So I know that Ree is going to talk about some of the programs that are available. This is what I want to say about the SBA loan. So there's Meryl, I don't know, and you can type in a response to me if you're still on here. I don't know if you're talking about the EIDL or if you're talking about the Paycheck Protection one, but there's the grant that you get as part of the EIDL, which is that like kind of automatic grant that the $10,000 advance is forgiven. Then there's which is I think what you're talking about because you put $10,000 in there. There's also the Paycheck Protection program, which is also an SBA small business loan. And that is more complicated. It's also apparently a humongous shit show today, which I don't think is surprising to anybody. But if you apply for the Paycheck Protection program, and thank you for sending, I got it, Emily. The Paycheck Protection program, you can receive forgiveness on that loan for the part that you use for payroll, and then 25% of that, up to 25% of that payroll when you use it for rent and utilities. Now, I just want you to think about and this is a longer answer to this question, and maybe you're all on here to hear about the SBA loans, but like, I think that if you are thinking about taking out an SBA loan and you happen to be one of the businesses that qualify for the SBA loan, meaning not a cannabis business or a cannabis adjacent business, which I know Ree is going to talk about, but if you apply for one of those, you're essentially transferring the responsibility for paying for yourself, your staff, payroll from the government to taking it on as a debt, even if that debt winds up being forgiven. And if you can figure out how you're going to apply for forgiveness or when that's going to be granted, you're better at reading shit than I am. So that's kind of your first thing. The second thing is the language on the form say up to 25% of your rent will be forgiven. So remember, you are taking out a debt that must be repaid. And in 6 months or a year, the federal government could decide that they're going to forgive 10% of that. So I think it's important for you to consider that you're just shifting the burden from the federal government over to yourself for what I can only say are a variety of different reasons. So Meryl, I think it said EIDL. So I don't know the answer to that because I haven't seen it in the rules. So maybe Ree will be able to answer what he talks about, whether the $10,000 you get as part of the IEDL will count it looks like SBA loans are $10,000 which goes through utility. Is this true or simple? If we applied for the grant, does that count as part of the SBA forgiven loans? And I don't think that the Prosper Portland grant will be subtracted. I think that's the question you're asking, Meryl. So I think the $10,000 will still be forgiven because that's a grant. And then if you're borrowing under the Paycheck Protection, that is something that will need to in fact be forgiven. That's my best answer to that under the circumstances. Emily, I'm gonna try and share this. Everybody else should ignore the rest of my emails. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to cover up my emails. Hang on, let me close the rest of my stuff that's up here.
I know, I did all of those things, and then when I went to share it, it was like, you need to restart Zoom in order to share. I was like, no, let's not do that.
All right, Emily, just tell me when to skip through.
Okay.
I am shared. Can you all see surviving and thriving?
Yeah, can you make it larger?
Yes. That's how large I can make it.
Ah, perfect. Okay, we can page to the next one. I tried to go with a very calming, you guys know who I am. We can skip to the next one. I tried to go with a calming motif. I understand that fish tanks help to lower people's blood pressure, so I thought I could do a fish tank background. Okay, so I actually, in all of these times, it's funny because cannabis has gone through a multitude of crises since I started investing. And when I was looking up what the definition of crises is, I thought it was interesting in terms of kind of grabbing hold of it. And it's what it says, when in a vitally important or decisive state of things, a point at which change must come for better or for worse. And so I feel like we're certainly at an inflection point. And can you page back one more? It seems like it's jumping. Yeah, okay. So I just thought it was important for us to point this out because our industry just went through, quote unquote, a crisis in the fall with the vape crisis. And then before that was when Jeff Sessions rescinded the Cole memo. Things always seem really complicated in our space. And so I just wanted to, on a point, I've been kind of trying to drive this home with our founders and with other people in the industry. I can't think of an industry of founders that have been more battle tested than the cannabis industry. Nothing has come easily to us. We've all had to work extraordinarily hard to get to where we are today. And this means even for somebody who's in the very, very early stages of their business. So to me, this is an inflection point globally, an inflection point in terms of the consumer psyche going forward. I don't think the world will ever be the same. I think this is one of those moments in time, although it's a very long and drawn out moment where we're all sheltering in place and we don't know when it will end. But I think that the next 18 months are going to be defining what happens for the entire world. And even over the summer, I think we're going to see some pivoting and learning about what the new landscape is going to look like. We can go to the next slide, Amy. So I guess I'm just saying, I think you're all well prepared. So, you know, we're not technically in the US in a recession. Globally, we are in a recession. Anybody who's looking at the unemployment numbers understands that things are about to get pretty gnarly, although the markets seem to be totally impervious to this. I don't really understand. But during the last recession, I was consulting with a number of consumer brands and also with media brands and American Express. So things I was very attuned to during that downturn is that obviously people will stay in more. In this instance, we have to. So what do people do when they stay in? They cook more, they watch more movies, they do home improvement projects. And historically speaking, during downturns and recessions, people spend on booze, pets, and on their kids. And in this instance, many of us have hypothesized over the last few years that cannabis would fall into that recession-proof and maybe even resistant or maybe even resilient industry categories. So I think that cannabis is really well positioned at this time to emerge and have kind of its moment with society, not only because people use it to have kind of escapism or to open their mind and have that recreational benefit to it, but I also view cannabis as different from alcohol in the fact that it is a wellness resource. And let's face it, we live in the time of a health crisis. And so if cannabis can be something that's more beneficial to our health and beneficial to our wellness program, I think people are going to be thinking a lot more about how we stay healthy going forward, because coronavirus has gone after people who have struggled with deficiencies or asthma. Like I have asthma. Certain people are more susceptible to becoming very, very ill with this. And I think it's something we're going to all be thinking about. So I think we'll see a societal shift, and I think cannabis stands to be there. The reason I'm saying this is that it does make a difference in terms of when you will be able to attract investment into your business. Let's go to the next slide. Okay. Whoa, that looks crazy. Okay, well, I'm going to make this available to you guys. So the first things you have to do in terms of what's happening right now is go to the front lines of your business, and that's the financial pieces. So if you have a CFO, if you have a controller, whoever's running the financial piece of your business, preserving cash is going to be critical. You're going to want to evaluate the liquidity of your business and the cash position of your business. And we're telling our founders to ensure that you have a minimum of 18 months of runway. If it's 12 months, that's also good because that means it's gotten you into Q1 of 2021. So you'll want to review your cash position, your burn, and your runway. So our founders were all building financial models for this year that had a base case, meaning that's like where you really think you can hit it, your reach case, which is like you're hitting it out of the park. And now everybody has a COVID-19 case. And this is like major disaster planning. And the thing I always say about a crisis or a disaster in business is the worst thing you can do is not look at it, because if you don't look right at it and look down the barrel of that gun, you won't know what's coming. And so you have to look it square in the eye and name and know the thing that could be the threat to your business. And in this instance, it's lack of cash and lack of runway, because we all have to get through this time of uncertainty. So if you have vendors, I would start to Chris Massey's point. I mean, we have contracts in place. There are ways to call up your vendors and to create better relationships, because let's face it, people would rather you pay rather than you're going to go out of business and then they'll never see a penny out of you. So it's better to start negotiating and creating those relationships and understandings about what is going to help you to get through this time and ultimately to remain a customer. To the same extent, contemplate your collections and chargebacks. This has been a long-running issue in California already, where people have had long-running AR and then all of a sudden nobody's paying. So you've got to find this balance in terms of making sure that you're getting paid so that your cash flows don't completely hit the skids. So I would stay on top of it. A lot of people are doing COD. I know that's kind of counterintuitive to the previous point I made, but try to find a way to make sure that you're not getting way behind on your AR, because the further you get behind, the harder it is to collect. And then you'll want to review different areas of spend. And I think one of the things that comes up during this time is marketing, and especially in the cannabis industry, because we have a real challenge with how we spend on marketing and where you can succeed on that. I do think that certain areas of spend, such as IR, which is investor relations, and PR, public relations, are important, because I think there are going to be a lot of stories to be told in this time. And I think it's a way to convey the value proposition of your product or brand or service in particular. But I think in general, start thinking carefully about what this looks like to be marketing, because it's not a time to have the luxury to determine the ROI on what we're doing. We can go to the next slide. The blinding speed of technology. Okay. So the next piece of this is really a difficult one, and I'm so glad that I just followed an employment lawyer, because I will say I am not an employment lawyer, and everything is very critical that you check the states that you're employing through, because every state has different regulations around this. Especially California is a very tricky state to be an employer, so I highly recommend engaging the services of an employment lawyer so you're sure you're not creating issues, and really thinking about how to do this. But what you do want to do during this time is, it is a tough time and it's tough to make employment decisions. But one of the things we're talking about with our companies is that you're not going to be any good to anyone if you go out of business, and then you cannot be a long-term viable employer. So it is important to think about how to run through your org chart, run through the necessary parts of your business to keep either at default alive or to be growing and scaling your business. And I do have some resources at the end of this presentation. So the way we talk about this is, and by the way, I'm a vegan, so this is a totally gross analogy, but you start by cutting the fat first. So what are the nice to have parts of your org chart? What are the parts that are really like in a scaling, growing mode? These are the positions that exist. Then you go into the muscle and the infrastructure, and then the bone. And so you want to try to think about this in terms of prioritizing how you're making cuts, if you have to make cuts. It's very difficult. It's very difficult to do this. And as Amy was just saying, thinking about furloughs versus layoffs. And there are also things I've seen some of our companies doing, like expediting vesting of options, or and just so that people can, if they do get laid off, they do have that piece of the company that they were working towards in earnest, and they would have been able to vest. And so there's some things you can do to alleviate cash flow, but also to acknowledge the employees that you're letting go. And in many cases, these are employees that you may want to be able to hire back once that things are stabilized. So think this through in terms of prioritizing. The other thing is, we do not typically recommend multiple rounds of layoffs. If you have to do a round of layoff, we recommend kind of going kind of deeper on the cut at first. Of course, you want to evaluate all of this by running through different financial scenarios, but you want to typically do one big cut of layoffs. And again, I'm talking in generalities here because I don't know all of the businesses that are on the line, and these are just general best practices. But if you do like one layoff, and then you do another, and then you do another, what happens is you're eroding the morale of the team that's left behind, and they're just waiting for the next shoe to drop. And secondly, you're also not really putting yourself in that disaster or crisis prevention mode in terms of your burn rate. So you really want to think about this very carefully. One of my favorite books as a reference, as a resource, is called The Hard Thing About Hard Things. And it's a Ben Horowitz book, and you can find excerpts of it online, but I would definitely read that book right now. And he does talk about what he went through with some of his businesses in these types of difficult environments and rounds of layoff. So again, check with your lawyers first. I should say that across the board on everything, but this is one of the things we're thinking about with our companies. And it will be important that you extend your run rate as long as you possibly can. We can go to the next slide. So raising in the time of COVID-19. If you must raise capital during this time, and I have to say, it's a difficult time to raise money because investor sentiment is very, 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 very low, especially in what we would characterize the cannabis industry as a more risk-on environment. I know this because we just closed our second fund raise on Tuesday night, and I can't tell you how difficult that raise became starting around the third week of February and where we are now. I was up till midnight closing people, and it was an extraordinarily difficult conversation, and conversations changed drastically within the course of 60 days. So if you do have to raise money, I do have some thoughts about this. The first thing I would do is look to your equity investors if you have them. So equity investors, the benefit of looking to those folks first is that they're already on your cap table. They are people who are in your business already, and it is to their benefit to see that your business survives. They are not sitting on the top of the cap structure with a debt piece typically, or maybe they do, maybe they have both, but these folks are aligned with wanting your business to succeed and go to an exit. So I definitely would look to your equity investors. Have a conversation with them, gauge their appetite, see if you have investors, of course. If you do not have investors and you're very early in your business, I would say it is a difficult time to be going out for a fresh raise of capital. And I would be pointing to all of the ways that your business can generate cash flow during this time. If you are pre-revenue and pre-concept and pre-build, it may be a time to contemplate holding off. I never want to discourage anyone from jumping in, but timing is everything in terms of raising money and in terms of attracting investment. And of course, it varies widely case by case, but it is a difficult environment to jump into right now with a brand new idea, knowing that you're going to have to kind of get through this market condition instead of just waiting a little bit till we get more understanding of what the new normal is going to look like. If you are going to go out for a raise, though, I would create a structure that's aligned for success and has aligned success and also has downside protection, because all investors right now are contemplating what is my downside protection in the event that this does not go well. And for what it's worth, founders, and this is something you have to keep thinking, a lot of the times right now, it is the COVID-19, it is not you. People are feeling very concerned about these massive externalities. I mean, let's face it, massive multinational corporations were not prepared for this pandemic. You can see it all the way across the board, from airlines to commodities companies. I mean, people just were not prepared for how this was going to impact the economy. And so I would say it's not a reflection so much on you as it's the environment. So you just have to kind of take that into consideration. So there are certain things you can do that you can create some like alignment-based structuring in your businesses. First of all, you can go with a convertible note. A convertible note over a safe in this environment is for a specific reason. I've always talked about the benefit of safes, which is that they're low cost to implement. They're a lightweight instrument. So for early stage companies, it's like a good starting point. And it's usually something that I would like to use for within within a year time frame. I don't really love holding safes for longer. And there's many reasons for that. And namely because it is a light instrument. It gives the investors very little to work with if things should go south. And I've been on the wrong side of that too. So it just has proven out, and I know many other investors have as well. but I do like them in certain instances. So, but right now, I think that investors are probably looking more for the security of a convertible note, which is very similar in many ways, but it does put you on that debt side of the capital spectrum. It gives you a little bit more of seniority in the cap structure and some more security, and they tend to be more robust. So I think knowing the investor psyche right now, I think that you'd see more interest in convertible notes than you would in safes. Again, there's always exceptions to that rule. This is just where I'm thinking now. If you're looking at doing a preferred equity or what's called a mezzanine debt structure, so you could do some part debt and then have warrants. Warrants are tricky because they typically come with a strike price or an exercise price. And if it's too low, when your investor exercises it, and by the way, it can be great when they exercise it because it's infused, they have to put money into your company in order to exercise those warrants in most instances. So that's beneficial, but it also can result in dilution that you maybe didn't anticipate for. So I would always run a pro forma cap table of what it would look like if you are looking to issue warrants. But what you can do, and what we have done, is create warrants that cure, or basically go away when you hit certain milestones. And that's something you can negotiate with your investors. So that's a way you can say, hey, look, if we get to this revenue run rate, which we think we can achieve even in the time of COVID-19, then these warrants cure or they go away. If we don't, then you get to exercise warrants, you put more money into our business, and you have more ownership interest in our company. So there's a couple of ways you can kind of structure these things, and I would just think about it. This is the time to get creative, not too creative, because too creative can sometimes feel atypical and uncomfortable for investors, but there are ways to think about alignment-based structures. A lot of people are talking about how there's interest in debt right now. I have a lot of reservations about what I am seeing on the debt side of the cannabis industry because I think that there is a lot of loan to own activity going on. I don't know if you've all heard of that, but basically it means that someone loans money to a company knowing that they probably will not be able to service the debt or pay the debt, and that they're going to get upside down on that debt. And then basically the person who's senior and secured, meaning they're on top of everybody, and maybe they've got your assets secured as a piece of the debt, they can basically take your business or take your assets. It's happening in a lot of places in this industry, and it will continue to happen. So be very careful that when you're contemplating taking on debt, I would do very heavy stress testing of your financial models to make sure that you can service that debt, because you do not want to run into that issue where all of a sudden you're upside down. And I don't really know, I'm confused by the investors who are doing this because most of them are not operators, and I don't know, I'm not really interested in all of a sudden owning and running a cannabis operation because I'm not the best person to do it, but I'm a good person to give you money to do it. So I'm curious to see how this is going to play out. And then I would just caution on all of that. While I've said all of that, I would be very careful to think down the line, right? To when COVID-19 is a part of the culture, it's a part of our lives, but things have normalized, to not put structures in that could discourage future investors. And so that is another piece of the debt thing to think about, because a lot of investors are very concerned if they see debt that is very difficult to service, and there's a lot of technicalities around that. But just think, we have to get through this time, but you don't also want to cut off your nose to spite your face, or whatever that expression is. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Okay. All right, so calibrating and adjusting. This is one of the things we always talk about. I'm not a big fan of when everybody says, oh, we just pivot our business all the time. That's not what I'm trying to say here. But what I am trying to say here is that there's oftentimes when there are points of friction or massive challenges, there are also opportunities that present themselves. So I'm from Buffalo, we're hockey fans. Wayne Gretzky always says, skate to where the puck is going, not where it is right now. We don't really know where the puck is going because I don't think any of us have contemplated what a world with this pandemic looks like, but we're trying to, right? And so we're trying to think about what consumer trends might be, how we can get to where that is, how can we lean in on our policy side to make sure that cannabis remains essential. So I would look at your business not in terms of just, is my business model going to fail, but are there other opportunities that I didn't contemplate for ways to drive additional growth or revenue during this time? You just don't know. I think a lot of retailers are really enjoying the fact that delivery has been opened up earlier than they thought it would in their markets. And so that's created this interesting direct to consumer potential experience. So there are things to think about, and just know this, that it is going to change a few times over before we get to what the new normal is going to look like. So calibrate and adjust and acknowledge that things are going to change. On the next piece, the next slide, investor relations. So as I was kind of talking about in the beginning of the fundraising section, turning to your investors, they're probably one of your best aligned and most dedicated resources you can have. So during this time, I would contemplate special communications plans. So you want to probably increase the frequency. Don't overload them with information, but I would say probably with your board of directors especially, and if you don't have one, I would think about board of directors or advisors, anybody who you can build in around you as resources and sounding boards. A lot of our companies are kind of doing once a week check-ins or bi-weekly check-ins during this time, and it's just a quick pithy email. These are the things that have happened. This is what we've done. We've executed on X, Y, and Z based on our last communication. They're seeking out board guidance on communications with the broader investor base. So keeping your investors updated is really important. Like, we do quarterly updates for most of our investors. We have done a few timely updates during this time, and we'll continue to do that because we know that in the absence of information, people start to freak out and panic. So I would send your board and your advisors sample emails, get their opinions, and then send it out to your investors. With your board, not with everybody on your investor list, but your active investors and your board, make sure you're upfront with them about concerns you have or challenges you have. This is not the time to be painting the rosy picture. It is the time to be very clear about what the challenges are and reach out and seek support. So for example, we've just provided our companies with, we did an update with a tax expert, insurance expert, policy expert, IR and PR. These are all really important resources that your active investors and your board of directors or advisors should be able to provide to you. But engaging that base will also help you if you do need to raise capital now, or if you want to raise capital in the near future. So making sure they're engaged and aware of what's happening in your business is really important. So that kind of brings me through to and then I have on here a resources slide of some things that I've been mentioning. So Ben Horowitz, he's a famous venture capitalist, runs A16 with his colleague, Mark Andreessen. He wrote the book, The Hard Thing About Hard Things. He also online, I actually posted it on my LinkedIn, is this great write-up front, and it's an excerpt from that book called Wartime versus Peacetime CEOs. I think it's an important one to dig in on because we certainly are at war with a very tiny thing that's making us all very turned upside down. But we're looking at how we can kind of gracefully engage in that environment. I have been addicted to data throughout this time because I think our assumptions are going to be tested time and time again in this space. So Headset is doing a great job with their Insights Pulse. So I definitely recommend that. I know Chris Massey mentioned it. And their blog is updated every 24 hours. And so I've been really following that. It's just like, why guess when you can actually look at what's happening? And then there's this interesting concept called default alive, which I've been prescribing to. It's an older concept, but I think it's an important one. And I included the link there, and I think we'll send this out. But it's really about if your business is going to be able to get to self-sustaining at a given point. And I think that if I back up on the macro world, there were a lot of businesses in the world that were never, in my opinion, going to get to default alive, like WeWork being an example of that. And I love WeWork, great, but I think that we need to, as an entire economy, think about our businesses and how we can get to default alive, like that they are businesses that can be self-sustained in even a normal environment, let alone a distressed environment like this. So I hope this has been a helpful and tactical set of resources for you all. Like I said, I think that this is a time to really lean in and test yourself and I will say that many great businesses have come through economic strife, including some businesses that maybe we don't love so much, but they've been successful. And like, I mean, even back to like IBM, or if you think about what came out of the Great Depression, Prohibition ended, a lot of parallels can be drawn. And a lot of people just got really, really careful about how they ran their businesses and what they did with the resources they had. And I think that people who come through this time will be thriving on the back end of it. So I'm optimistic in a way. Do you have questions?
I was muted. Thanks, Emily. Does anybody have any questions that they want to ask Emily? Lisa, I see you asked a question about raising money with the website Republic. I'm not familiar with that. Are you, Emily?
Is it a crowdfunding website?
Republic.co.
I don't see, is it in the question, in the Q&A?
It says it's a crowdfunding site.
Yeah, I mean, you could try it. I've seen varying degrees of success through crowdfunding sites, and I'm just not sure if they have I'm not familiar with that one, but some of them do have take rates or I would ask a lawyer to look at it too, if you have a lawyer colleague or a friend, just to make sure they're running within the regulations, because I feel like some of those are a little fast and loose for me. They make me a little uncomfortable in terms of following the regulations. So I would
just said 6% and $5,000.
Well, maybe Joyce knows better. So I don't want to throw shade. I don't know that one. So I would say,
well, Joyce, if you want to type something else into the chat, I'll read it out loud. And then somebody else asked, does Emily think that these past few weeks have been a blip in terms of cannabis sales, or will the massive layoffs result in a dip?
No, I think that we are going to see a very lumpy and accordion-like sales cycle, because I think it's going to be like, we're a society that hoards, right? Because we don't know what's coming next. We don't know if they're going to shut us into our homes and say you can't go outside. I don't think that'll happen, period. And we also don't know what the regulators will do. I mean, even like, I guess Santa Clara County, probably Joyce knows better, or maybe because I've been on webinars all day. The regulators are the wild card, right? Like, so there are two things we have to contemplate. There's consumer demand and whether or not we can staff and safely support the infrastructure to get it to the consumers. And then there's the regulator piece, like what's going on in Massachusetts, which is an absolute atrocity. Because it's just unbelievable what's happening there. So I think, I think there are a couple of things to think about, but I do think we'll see lumpy sales cycles while we figure out what this looks like. And what I think that we're seeing new ways that people are consuming cannabis in terms and incorporating it into their lives. Like, I've had unprecedented texts from my friends being like, I am drinking every night. I need to figure out if if I'm a cannabis person instead of drinking every night. I'm like, yeah, let's do this. It's going to be good for you. So, of course, caveated heavily that everybody has their own way. But, I think that we're going to find new ways that consumers are engaging with it throughout this time as we all get used to being maybe isolated a bit more and experiencing this in a different way.
All right. Does anybody have anything else that they want to ask Emily? We appreciate it. And we'll send around the slideshow. I don't know why it looked like that, but if you want to take a peek at it, we'll circulate all the PowerPoint that everybody's put together. The next up is Ree. Are you there, Ree?
Yep, sorry, I was on mute.
That's okay. Hi, Ree. So Ree's
Hi.
Senator Wyden's office, and for those of you who don't know Senator Wyden, he has been aggressively fighting for the cannabis industry without like laying out his whole resume. That he's been aggressively fighting for, in this particular instance, for the cannabis industry to be included in some of the relief that's happening right now, if we consider it relief. And so we're very, very appreciative of his work on behalf of the cannabis industry and his work on behalf of like regular people instead of giant corporations receiving some help during these incredibly hard times. So I asked Ree to come and talk about what are the programs that are available through the federal government. And then I intend to circulate, if you're not on our newsletter, like just go to initiative.com. and make sure you're signed up. But I intend to circulate, and then we just started a blog feature on the website that'll go live, I think, on Monday. All of the resources that we've gathered that are available to small women-owned businesses and small businesses in general, and all of us, I think, are small businesses. So we'll put those together, and those are everything from like the Spanx woman just launched a grant program. And so we're going to try and keep that as updated as we can. But Ree is really here to talk about what the federal government has to offer or not offer to cannabis adjacent hemp businesses.
Hey, thanks, Amy. So again, my name's Ree Armitage. I'm staff to Senator Wyden in the Portland metro area. I work on cannabis-related issues, alcohol issues, business issues, trade and tax issues as well. So, I'll first off and say, I came on, I couldn't jump on until right when Emily was starting. And I'll say that, I'll just start off and say, you're all pioneers out there, and it's been an absolute honor in our office to work with your industry and to try to help protect and grow this industry in Oregon, and obviously the states that have entered the medical and adult use markets. Senator Wyden, along with my other former boss, Congressman Earl Blumenauer, authored the pathway to marijuana reform, and that's where we are trying to get marijuana descheduled, cannabis descheduled. Sorry, I'm using that term because it's the title of our legislation. But so I will just jump right into it and say we are working very, very hard, but it looks like we will be unable to have cannabis businesses or indirect cannabis businesses access the SBA programs. Everything you've heard from the EIDL programs, the PPP programs, that cannabis businesses or businesses that basically raise money from working with cannabis businesses are going to be unable to access any of these SBA programs. Now, my boss, Senator Merkley, California senators, all of our senators that are from adult use states, I think with the exception maybe of Cory Gardner in Colorado, are pushing the SBA to open up these loans, and we will continue to do that through the duration of this crisis. We've both done it to try in the upcoming appropriations, the annual yearly cycle that we would be in outside of this crisis, and within this crisis to try to get the SBA to open up those programs. We have not been successful yet, and we will be pushing for that in the next COVID-4 as well to try to open up these programs. We will see what's possible. Right now, I want to be completely frank with everyone that it looks highly difficult that we'll be able to open up these programs. It doesn't look like we will get the votes in Congress to be able to do that. And just to go back in time a little bit, this is why we've been pushing so hard to have cannabis descheduled, because all these millions and millions of people have decided that we should have these legal businesses. I know I'm speaking of the choir, and you all know this, but it's insane that all these states are coming online, and we've talked about states' rights throughout our history as Americans, and we can't get this Schedule I figured out, Congress after Congress, when new states are coming online and more people are exposed to these exact kind of currents that we're facing in our society. So I just want to say we are going to stay at it. We're going to keep fighting for cannabis businesses to make sure that they have access to their federal government. And as soon as we get information on that, I'll be pumping that out as quickly as possible. The one piece of good news is that for folks that do participate in unemployment insurance, standard unemployment insurance, my boss was the author of the large expansion of unemployment insurance in the CARES Act that just passed. And I'll walk through that a little bit. I'm going to open my screen up here and go to, let's see here. Give me 1 second to go on to my, okay. Apologies, I'm being one of the.
Oh my God, I love all of the things that are in your tabs. It's like The Hill and Roll Call and Walkwire and Clear Policy and Real Clear Politics and Politico. It's amazing.
Yeah. I'm even, jumping off topic just for a second, we're really concerned about, and you probably see some of these we're trying to get some extra domestic violence protections in here too. So we're working on those. Here, I'm going to back out of this here. There it is. So, we're working on so many issues right now. Not to step away from cannabis just for a sec, but yeah, so many issues about what people are needing. And, Emily was so good about talking about coming through these types of crises in throughout our history. And, hopefully we will all find a way to take care of each other in these times. And, you are all absolutely resilient folks to be having to deal with this, and not getting help from your government right now is terrible. So I'm going to open up, and everybody can see the Senator Wyden's page here. Is it all making sense there? Okay. So this is our website. And if you just go to wyden.senate.gov, it's right there front and center. And I'll start with unemployment insurance. So for everybody who can participate in unemployment insurance and who does, you should be able to have your employees participate if you need to take that route of laying folks off. So unemployment insurance is available for folks that participate. That is one part of the federal government that isn't affected, is our understanding, and we're pushing and have been pushing for that, and that has been okay. But I know that's not, folks want to grow their business and protect their businesses, and that's not exactly why folks are probably on this call, which is the PPP. So this is the SBA's Paycheck Protection Act, or Paycheck Protection Program. And unfortunately, as we continue to push, like I said, folks are not able to take advantage of that program if they're in a cannabis related business. Some hemp businesses that are legal will be able to participate. The problem there is the ag, I know there was some discussion in the chat about agricultural businesses. Right now, they can participate in the PPP program. If you're an agricultural business, a legal hemp business, it's federally legal. But you can't participate in a lot of the other SBA programs because those are USDA, Department of Agriculture programs, which we have yet to get the guidance on. But for federally legal hemp businesses, they are able to participate in the Paycheck Protection Program. And then we are going to be, yeah.
Can you go, we had a question, and I think this is a good time to talk about it. So somebody asked, what qualifies as an associated cannabis business? So if we know that associated cannabis businesses are ineligible to take part in the Paycheck Protection Program, can you talk about, and you read to me a pretty good description yesterday, what the associated businesses are?
Yeah, so I'm actually, and this, people might have saw this just for a sec, this is the guidance here on an indirect marijuana business. A business that derived any of its gross revenue for the previous year, or if a startup projects to derive any of its gross revenue for the next year from sales to direct marijuana businesses of products or services that could reasonably be determined to support the use, growth, enhancement, or other development of marijuana. Examples include businesses that provide testing services, sell grow lights, hydroponic equipment to one or more direct marijuana businesses. In addition, businesses that sell smoking devices, pipes, bongs, inhalants, or other products that may be used in connection with marijuana are ineligible if the products are primarily intended or designed for such use, or if the business markets the products for such use. So these SBA guidelines are still live. We are pushing them, of course, to change these guidelines, and we'll keep doing that throughout this crisis and until we get descheduled. So that is where we are at right now. Obviously, and I can give the definition too, just so folks know exactly what a direct marijuana business is under SBA law or SBA regulations. A business that grows, produces, processes, distributes, or sells marijuana or marijuana products, edibles, derivatives, regardless of the amount of such activity. This applies to personal use and medical use, even if the business is legal under local or state law where the applicant business is or will be located. So just so people have that definition. And so again, we will keep fighting. I know that there's a large group of congressional caucuses, both in both the Senate and the House. Pretty much our entire Oregon delegation is pushing hard on this, except for Greg Walden out in the eastern part of the state. I know a lot of California representatives, Illinois, all the legal states, Michigan, now coming on board. I know there's all kinds of, as Emily mentioned, all kinds of regulatory issues with Massachusetts, and we've heard that a little bit. Don't pay a ton of attention because we're trying to help Oregon businesses that have their own set of issues. But there's a lot of people in Congress that are pushing hard for this, and we'll just continue to do that. And I know you all want and need help right away. And all I can say is that my boss, Senator Wyden, and politicians, good politicians around this country, are going to do all we can to keep pushing and try to help folks get through this. I do know that out in the private sector there will be folks that are available to help, and you guys will be having to make tough decisions. I do hope that we see delivery and some of the curbside practices that are happening in Oregon grow, and people adapting to that. And we'll continue to help however we can. I'd be willing to answer any more questions. I wish that I was able to offer better news for you all.
So I see that there's a bunch of questions, and I think maybe I'm probably, at least the people who are on here, the best suited to answer them. But I think the questions seem to be pretty practical, and you can see them in the chat. So I think most of the questions are around, do the associated and adjacent businesses include things like legal, accounting services, marketing, real estate? And I think, let me ask you before I answer it, do you want to answer that first?
No, go ahead, Amy.
So first of all, this is not legal advice. Wait, hang on, I'm not on the video either. So this is not legal advice, because we're recording this. So the first thing is you should check with your lawyer. The second thing is, and those of you who've been in cannabis for a long time know that you should not be dishonest with your bank. You should not be dishonest with a lender. You should not be dishonest with anybody who you're going to for a loan. I think, we used to talk about 280E, and I see somebody just wrote something because of 280E. We used to talk about whether or not, and I think you could apply, in theory, the same standard we apply to 280E, which is, the question is how many ripples out are you away from your cannabis business? So, we had a question about real estate. So if you happen to lease to cannabis businesses, but you also lease to lots of other businesses, you might consider how many steps away from being a directly adjacent to cannabis are you? And the same thing I think is, and I would use that as a standard for evaluating that. And again, it's not legal advice and you should never be dishonest. But I think that if you're a marketing company and you also do cannabis work, the question is, are you really a cannabis adjacent business? If you're Miller Nash, are you really a cannabis adjacent business just because you have cannabis clients who you assist? And so I know that that's very squishy and not a very good answer to that, but I think you're going to have to use your own judgment. And in my mind, the kind of worst case scenario is that you have somebody who's clearly a cannabis adjacent business who is dishonest and gets in trouble. And I'm certain that there are going to be a number of consequences for small businesses that do that, while corporations will continue to raid our coffers. I think the other side of that is, sorry, that was my own political feeling about what's happening. But I think the other side of that is and for those of you who are accountants and lawyers and marketers who've had your bank account shut down and you're like, why am I getting my bank account shut down? I think that's a good indication that someone might notice what you're doing. So, I've had my law office account shut down on multiple occasions, and that's how they found out I work with cannabis businesses. Beats the shit out of me. So I think, using your best judgment, making sure you're honest, making sure you can justify how you're not a cannabis adjacent business are probably the way that you should guide yourself. Do I think you're going to get better guidance than that? I think anybody who gives you their perspective is taking the best shot of it, like I am.
Yeah, I would just add that, that when you go to your SBA, let's say that you don't consider yourself an indirect cannabis business and you go to your SBA lender and think that you can take advantage of the PPP program, they'll make a determination whether or not they're going to participate and offer the loan. It's kind of that simple. And as your and Amy mentioned this, the SBA PPP program is just rolling out today. Some banks are getting started. Some aren't. Some are doing things like we already heard Bank of America is saying that you have to have an existing account with them, which obviously isn't going to work for tons of people. So we're going to work, we're already fast at work trying to update those rules and get the SBA to either deal with that in rulemaking, or we'll fix it in this next package, which I mentioned that we're going to be pushing, will be pushing for acceptance for cannabis businesses to the SBA in the next package as well. I should add, there's a question down here about 280E and the income and the individual checks. The individual relief checks will still come to folks. So sorry, I kind of acted, I should have not assumed that everybody kind of knew that. Folks that have any of a tax ID will get that. In terms of 280E and the income, I can't speak to that too much because it's in terms of it not being reflective. If you're over 100 grand in income individually, you're not going to be able to get the individual relief checks.
Can I add something to that? I mean, I think if you're subject to 280E, then you're probably considered a cannabis business. So, I mean, we've had this conversation, and I think everybody who's on this call, we've gone back and forth as attorneys about whether or not you need management companies or whether or not you need intellectual property companies, or, if there are ways that, and, I'm thinking, and I think Emily's thinking, and Chris is thinking, and Ree is thinking, and Amy is thinking, like, how do you kind of plan for whatever comes next? And I think for all of us, there's a question about whether or not having a non-cannabis entity would have been helpful in this situation. But if you're subject to 280E, I think it's worth considering, really, if you're actually a cannabis business. That might be a good guidepost.
Right, exactly. Yeah. You can't offer accounting advice, but yes, that's our understanding. I mean, if you're not being able to deduct anything, basically. So. Yeah.
And I see that there's another question in the Q&A, and I think I've answered it about cannabis marketing companies. I think when Ree and I talked about it yesterday, we both maybe thought that applied to cannabis marketing companies. But again, I think you're going to kind of use your best judgment and how you approach it, recognizing that, like, there are likely to be consequences if the bank disagrees with you or is discovered. But I also think we're all kind of unclear how this program's rolling out at this point. I will say that the city of Portland, for those of you who are in Portland, the city of Portland is considering their own program to help cannabis businesses. So, this is, again, like a giant dumpster fire, and no one knows how it's going to end. But I know that the city of Portland is working on those programs, and we'll try and keep people up to date about what's happening with that.
Yeah, I should, and I can't speak directly for our state legislature, and I know that other folks on this call are from different states. I've heard, and this is me just now sort of stepping out of my role and being just kind of another citizen who's hearing things. But I am making, a lot of calls to legislators and hearing that because of the tax revenue that the state takes in, and the local tax and the state tax, that there is some talk, and that's all I've heard that it is at this point, of potentially returning some of those funds to folks that are struggling in the industry. And I know that a lot of folks on this call that might be Oregonians are already lobbying their state legislators to do that whenever they go into session.
And you might want to consider, if you are lobbying your state legislator, that in fact they should have a special session eventually here, so we're not all fucked.
Right, and they need to be thinking about things. I mean, as a citizen now, not as a staffer to a federal elected, but they need to be thinking about these things, about these businesses that either because of terrible politicians out there federally, or because of just various regulatory issues and otherwise, some businesses that are going to fall through this. I mean, folks have heard about, just on the individual side, older Social Security recipients that were concerned about getting their relief check. And so we've been pushing hard to make sure that some of these funds get down to hardest hit folks and the most vulnerable among us. So, flip that on folks that are businesses that aren't just able to access programs, to push your state legislatures to think about those folks as well.
Does Maggie, do you have your hand up? How can you chat? Because I don't know if I have I see. Maggie, do you want to talk? Unmute. Maggie, I don't know how to help you talk, but if you text it, I can see for some reason that you're in my thing. All right, Ree, does anybody else have any more questions for Ree while we have him on the phone?
I'll just say, I saw a link to all your congressional representatives. Yeah, go find your congressperson and lobby them, and also your state legislators.
So thanks, Ree. I appreciate it. We appreciate all the hard work that you've done and that you're gonna do, and stay safe out there.
Glad to participate. Thank you all.
So I got a question from somebody, and I want to make sure that we answer it. Let me get to it. So, and then I'll hand this over to Ryan, who will talk about staffing opportunities. So this ties into my question I sent via email, which says a lot of farms and grows consider their workers independent contractors when they're actually employees. If the workers are treated as an independent contractor, the grow farm doesn't pay into state unemployment, pay taxes, or workers' compensation, so the laid-off employee can't likely apply for unemployment. Just wanting to address employer compliance and worker compliance. So I want to say two things to that. The first is, if you've been incorrectly, there are a lot of existing remedies if you've been incorrectly treated as an independent contractor instead of an employee. So that's the first and most important thing. So even if nothing was happening and you thought you were wrongly characterized, there are a lot of resources, and I would recommend that you go to BOLI, which is the Bureau of Labor and Industries, and they have a lot of places for you to make a report. You can also sue them if you wanted to sue them. And so there are some existing remedies for that situation, and I think the cannabis industry has been facing those challenges for a long time. And the cannabis industry has been facing that challenge for a long time in incorrectly characterizing people as independent contractors and W-2 employees. They are, I don't know if you're in Oregon or somewhere else, Heather, but Oregon is allowing, and I think everywhere else is allowing, independent contractors to apply for unemployment. And so you can go to Oregon, and I just walked myself through the unemployment so I could see what it looked like. So there is a place for you to still apply, even if you're treated as a self-employed or independent contractor. So just keep that in mind, that in this situation, you're not excluded from applying for unemployment, but there are additional remedies if you need them for being inappropriately characterized. Hopefully that answered your question. All right, so let's introduce Ryan Rosenfeld. We're going to talk about staffing. I don't know, this I think is a very kind of specific issue, which is if you are a grow or a dispensary or a wholesale and you're having this kind of staffing churn, how to manage that. And so we brought Ryan. He's from Green Force Staffing. He's done a lot of work with the initiative. We just wanted to make sure that you all, if you needed help with that, had a resource, and then we'll close up the webinar. We'll continue to do these. We're going to start really going deep on the resources, and so people have help. And you should always feel like you can reach out to the initiative if you have questions. If you have questions like the worker protection questions, we're here to help. We know lots of things about lots of things, and if we don't know, we know where to send you. So please email us at info@intheinitiative.com if you have questions or need help with things. And here is Ryan.
Thanks, Amy. Can everybody hear me okay? Is it good? I'm going to share my screen, see if I can make this work. And hopefully that's working. Yeah, thanks so much for the invite. I'm grateful to be here, grateful to be on the panel. As Amy said, my name is Ryan Rosenfeld. I'm the founder, president of Green Force Staffing. A little bit about Green Force. We're an Oregon-based workforce labor solutions agency. It's basically a fancy way for saying we're a staffing agency. We partner with a number of producers, processors, wholesalers, retailers in the state of Oregon, providing them with labor solutions of all types: plant touching, harvest support, trimming, packaging, edible, pre-roll production. We also do recruiting for executive placements, director of sales, salespeople, CPA, bud tenders, etc. So my goal here is to provide you some insight about the labor challenges that we're facing, not only as a nation, but specifically our industry, and shed some light on some questions you might have about labor, best practices, staffing needs. So I'm going to kind of start by just sharing some of the stuff that we're seeing with our partners. So this is actually a really good breathing exercise that I practice religiously every day, if not every hour. I'd like to share it with you. On the count of 3, we'd like to say, what the fuck? So 1, 2, 3, what the fuck? Okay, that's the end of my presentation. But what we're seeing out there is some of the obvious, reduction of internal staff, skeletal crews, reduction of salaries, budget cuts, furloughs, uptick in retail sales, followed by some downturn, increased production needs, but reduced and halted crew size and output. A lot of uncertainty, how do I get people to work? How many people can show up? What I'm also seeing is a lot of gratitude. The fact that we still have people, we're still cutting paychecks. People are very grateful to be in the industry that we're in. Obviously, it's one that people are very passionate about. Everybody on this call has kind of touched upon that. We are trailblazers so to speak, and we're definitely earning our keep right now. Kind of getting to a little bit more of the what we're seeing out there is, and what's I think is crucial, and what we think is crucial right now is flexibility. We're seeing these production timelines being shifted and altered. People are having to get creative with providing essential labor in a safe setting. What Greenforce does, we curate daily and weekly labor support, project specific teams. We're seeing, people go to split shifts, swing shifts, 4-10s, 3-10s, 7-day work week, the accordion-like labor model where people are just bringing necessary people in when it's possible. Obviously with the kind of shift in retail, with the onus of some of the delivery, I think we're going to start seeing some kind of creative delivery methods being utilized, and that's something that we're happy to help with. If not help with, happy to talk with you about it if we can provide any insight. Safety is obviously the next big one. We're conducting frequent huddles with our crew, obviously at safe spaces in the mornings, just to ensure everybody's on the same page. We're seeing a lot of expanded kind of production space, which is an item that can be kind of tricky with camera coverage, per the OLCC, but people are working in traditionally non-production spaces to ensure social distancing, work distancing, having a trained and prepared team. Greenforce is constantly providing our own supplies, making sure it's sanitary, out of the box, new supplies. And this is something interesting that one of my employees brought up, which is coming on taking temperature of employees. And this is something that I don't think is normally allowed. And I pulled this off of the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. But I think in times like this, generally measuring employees' body temperature is a medical examination. But if a pandemic influenza, similar to the H1N1 in spring, summer of 2009, if it becomes widespread, they're allowing employers may measure employers' body temperature. Obviously, with the COVID-19, fever isn't always a symptom, but it is something that we've seen a couple clients go to. Another thing that we're kind of touching upon is, sanitation, obviously. There's a company in Portland called Indo, which is a company that makes energy efficient window inserts. And we took some kind of best practices from there where they actually were ditching their doorknobs. It's kind of a lean manufacturing approach to, reducing exposure or transmission of COVID. Obviously, that's not always the case in, a cannabis production setting, but leaving doors open, reducing the amount of kind of surfaces, where people are, have need to touch to go through into structures, buildings, doors, rooms, etc. Obviously, constant cleaning of common spaces, workstations, bathrooms. Static crews. What we're doing is, for the most part, keeping our crews the same, working together as much as possible to minimize exposure to the workplace and lessen new employee interaction. We've obviously hammered home tons of communications. Don't come to work if you're sick. If you're not feeling well, stay at home. I'm not a labor attorney, but there are numerous new sick time things taking into effect as most recently as of Wednesday. So hopefully some of our employees that aren't feeling up to snuff have the ability to utilize some of that. And then the big one is HR support. This is a complex one to begin with, and is getting more complicated by the hour. You've got that whole 1099 versus W-2 item we just talked about. All Green Force employees are actually W-2 employees. They have sick time. We cover workers' comp. Something that Green Force has started engaging with most recently is, we do all virtual interviews. Our onboarding process is actually all digital, so we can, kind of bring on new employees in a, work from home, stay at home setting. We already have an established labor pool. I think we're going to see an uptick of applicants here with the unemployment rate, going where it is. But then a lot of these new kind of sick time management, the FFCRA stuff, time tracking, benefits. We've been blessed. We work with a payroll company, Paylocity. If anybody needs any, suggestions or recommendations, they've been very proactive with executing a lot of these new implementations about the labor changes and tracking of this stuff. Then training, which is a huge one. Making sure that you have reliable crews in the field. Green Force, all crews come with a trained lead who is going to run the crew and act as that conduit between a team and our partners. Maintaining that workplace safety. These leads are trained to identify issues to help prevent the spread of, COVID or, any other safety issues, working with the on-site ambassador. And then kind of getting into the rebuild with some of these organizations that have, kind of stripped down to a skeletal, crew. What are the proper steps for rebuilding it or supplementing it? Temp staffing, which is something that we do. We work well either as a replacement or supplemental, to existing teams. We can kind of have traditionally we've done a lot of temp to hire where we have a lot of clients who were our best employees get kind of, hired on by our clients, which is a blessing and a curse. We like to see that kind of progression through the industry. Traditionally it was typically used as more of a chemistry fit, kind of try before you buy, just to ensure that they worked well, they were reliable. But I think now moving forward with, these times, it's going to be more of maybe a financial fit. Is this person something that we absolutely need? So do we need this person full time or is it part time? And these are a lot of questions that I think everybody's, asking themselves, us included. So it's crazy times out there, and we're trying to kind of work with all of our partners to identify best steps forward, to ensure viability for all parties involved. Then just kind of like last slide, just what did we do, internally? Lots of communications, lots of reading, a lot of group therapy. We manage multiple remote workforces, so we don't see all of our employees all the time. With Green Force, we kind of had a work from home policy with the main operational leadership team. With our crews in the field that were essential, we were trying to figure out ways to engage with them. So we had weekly or daily, Zoom happy hours. Obviously we've seen a payroll and hours reduction on our leadership team as well, just to ensure that we can keep our employees in the field paid. My goal right now as the leader is to keep as many paychecks rolling in as possible in the safest possible setting, which is kind of is a juggle. But wise words is crisis exposes character, and we're trying to figure out ways to blast through this with everybody else. That's pretty much all I have on my presentation. I don't know what questions we might have or best practices, or if people have specific examples that they're interested in. I'm happy to take any.
Does anybody have any questions for Ryan? I see one question about how to do engagement management when the manager and owner is remote, but everybody else is working at the manufacturing facility.
I mean, of our labor pool.
Of their own labor pool.
Of their own labor pool. That's a great question. I mean, we were having. The more communication, the better. I think seeing people wanting to be heard. We obviously don't have all the answers. I think being realistic, being upfront, and just listening to people was the best kind of path for us. As far as managing, depending on whether you're trying to track production or hours or project, we utilize Monday.com. It's like a project management tool that we utilize, all across the organization, both, internally and externally. We've had to, obviously kind of go with the flow and shift, the way that we're, conducting every communication, every, project management, every, workflow and process. So that's one example I like. I highly recommend them. If hopefully that helps.
That's great. Does anybody else have any other questions? I know we ran late. All right, I don't see any more questions. I just want to thank everybody for coming. It's really nice to, I guess I don't see any of you, but I'm like, I see all of you. And please feel free to send us an email. We'll send you something. If there's more information you need or want, or things that you want to see in the future, let us know. And we'll make sure that we start doing these more often, but more importantly, we can't wait to see you guys in real life soon. This is, I guess, going to end soon enough, and we'll all get back to whatever this looks like afterwards. So I hope you're all being safe and healthy. Thanks to the people who participated as panelists, and Maggie Connors, I apparently added you. Now you're also a panelist. Okay, I'll do better next time with my technology. And that's it. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to close the meeting up. Maybe.